Ulysses Grant Dietz served as Curator of Decorative Arts at the Newark Museum from 1980 until 2017 and was appointed Chief Curator in 2012. He received his Bachelor of Arts in French from Yale University in 1977 and his MA in American Material Culture from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program in 1980. During his tenure at Newark, he researched and collected furniture, silver, base metals, glass, ceramics, textiles, and jewelry for the museum's permanent collections, and it is an amazing collection, believe me. He's particularly proud of his work on the museum's National Historic Landmark, Ballantine House, built in 1885. The Ballantine House was reinterpreted between 1992 and 94 with a groundbreaking installation called House and Home, which Ulysses shepherded, and you may have seen an article recently that it's just gone through another reinstallation just moments ago, practically. Ulysses has published numerous articles on decorative arts drawn from the Newark Museum's nationally known holdings. Among his recent books are Masterpieces of Art Pottery, 1880 to 1930, from the Newark Museum, published by the Newark Museum in 2009, and Dream House, The White House as an American Home, released in September 2009 by Acanthus Press in New York. His last book as curator was Jewelry from Pearls to Platinum to Plastic, published in 2017. He organized no fewer than 115 exhibitions during his highly respected museum career, with topics ranging across media and across time periods. Hot, Hotter, Hottest, 300 Years of New Jersey Ceramics was in 2016. City of Silver and Gold, From Tiffany to Cartier, a 2014 exhibition of his, and The Art of Glass from Gallet to Chihuly, highlights from the Lowenbach collection in 2007, are just a few of his exhibition projects. Even in his retirement, Ulysses has continued to organize important and well-received exhibitions. In 2022, he collaborated with the Preservation Society of Newport County, Newport, Rhode Island, to produce Anything You Want, a closer look at treasures from America's Gilded Age. Ulysses Grant Dietz is a great-great-grandson of Ulysses and Julia Grant. He is a trustee of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University and of the Society of Presidential Descendants. We are very fortunate to have Ulysses with us today when he will be presenting White Gold, Porcelain is Art in the Gilded Age Home. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ulysses Grant Dietz.
Well, I want you to know I have already read this book cover to cover, and it's excellent. And the thing about it is that it's a book that should have been published in New Jersey by the Newark Museum, but it's the only book of its kind ever done in the United States. And it's a topic that's very dear to my heart, and so I was so thrilled not only that, and I had never met Brian until I got here yesterday, or he met me at the airport. And I was so thrilled by it because it was a topic that always mattered to me. But with the way things ran at the Newark Museum, with me constantly on a new learning curve to some other project, that I never got around to trying to put together a show that was just about the New Jersey ceramics and just about the role that New Jersey played in the development of this very fine, thin body called Belleek. With a small b in the United States. So it's something, and one of the things that, do I have it in my talk? See, this is, I can't even remember I won't even talk about it. I'll just talk, and if you have questions at the end, I'll see what I forgot. And I'm looking at the slides here, so I don't have to turn around. I have no notes, so I have to look at the pictures to know what I'm supposed to tell you. But I'm really thrilled to be here. I had so much fun yesterday going through the Uptown Mint, and I'm going to have more fun going through the rest of it. But the exhibition, I'm sure you've all seen the exhibit. You wouldn't come here for this talk if you hadn't. But it's incredible. It's a beautiful exhibition. And it's so thrilling to see these things and the sort of command they have in this day and age when old stuff and fussy Victorian stuff, which is, of course, completely my thing, is not in vogue completely in museums. It's wonderful to see such a important and beautiful exhibition devoted to it, and how proud the Mint should be with its great ceramic history of ceramic, and never mind, of collecting ceramics, to have done it. And I probably had more things I wanted to say, but thank you for having me here. What I'm here to do is one of the things I wrote to Brian early when he invited me to do this, as I said, well, you can't possibly want me to talk about the show because you did the show. Aren't you going to talk about it? And what he really wanted me to do was to do sort of a contextual thing. And even though I'm retired from the Newark Museum for 5 years now, I still refer to the museum as we, as if I still work there. And so that's something I guess that I'm never going to shake. But I thought the idea of the importance of porcelain. Why did Walter Lenox think anyone on earth wanted this? And the answer to that is because he understood that this was considered one of these precious materials that made your house beautiful, but also made you look good to the people who knew you. And you've got to remember that of always material culture is 50% function and 50% what other people think of you because you own it. And you can't forget that because if anyone tells you that's not true, it's a lie. And it doesn't matter if you're the Emperor of China or a shopkeeper in Charlotte in the 19th century, that matters. That material culture aspect of thing matters. So this opening slide here, I love because you're not going to see this house again, but this is the dining room of a very wealthy department store family named Hutzler, who were in Baltimore. And I actually have this slide because of the sideboards you can't see. But I thought you get a sense of the 19th century display methods. And I've been studying this slide, and I actually suspect that those big vases on the top shelf, which I thought were porcelain, I think are silver. And they're probably by Kirk, which was the big Baltimore silversmith. But the Hutzlers were a very wealthy Jewish department store family whose grandson, Louis Bamberger, founded the great department store in Newark that built the Newark Museum and gave the Newark Museum lots of things. So I've always felt a wonderful identity with the Hutzlers. And just to tantalize you, the sideboard you can't quite see at the other end of the dining room is a sideboard that's a model of the department store, made out of mahogany. So, and it's in a museum in Baltimore, but that's why I have the slide. But so I'm going to try to give you a context, not only for how porcelains were shown in houses and how they fit in with the other big two materials, which are bronzes and silver as ornaments in the American home in the Gilded Age. Because there is one truth about the Gilded Age is that more was more, and more was good. And the whole concept of less is more is a violent reaction to the Gilded Age. So I see how this is working. I have to look at the little image. So, and these are everything in this talk is from the Newark Museum collection, because in my last 5 years I was also the chief curator, so I interacted, and we were a very close team, the other curators and I was always interested in cultural overlaps and how things influenced and how certain aesthetics crept across cultures or between cultures. And what you're looking at here is the sort of beginning of the idea of ceramics as art, as ceramics as something that you display in your home. Porcelain, let's say porcelain, because these are both porcelains. I'm not going to get too far off the road from porcelain, which is a different kind of ceramics, and I can't give you that lecture, but it is a separate lecture. That porcelain is a magical material that is only known in the East, in the Far East, until the early 18th century. And on the left you have a great Dutch charger, a Chinese charger made for the Dutch market in the 17th century from Newark's collection. And you have a Japanese dish with the sailing ships and the Dutch merchants from the 17th century in Japan. And these were the kind of things that traders took back with them to the West in the 17th century and even earlier. I've just been in Portugal, and in the main museum in Lisbon, there are these incredible objects that show that when the Portuguese first contacted the Japanese in the 1540s, they began something that has never stopped all these years later. So, and then just very basic stuff. Owning porcelain, owning Chinese porcelain specifically, was a hot thing all through colonial America and into the federal period. These pieces here are all from Newark families from the 18th century. Actually, both of the families are Dutch. The old New York families of the Van Rensselaers and the Schuylers had big holdings in New Jersey and in Newark, and this soup tureen was part of a service that was given to the Newark Museum in the 1920s by a descendant of the Van Rensselaers, mid-18th century Chinese export, supposedly buried to protect it from the Hessians during the Revolution, but I don't believe any of that. And then the one on the right is a federal period set made for a Newark woman at the time of her marriage, Catherine Van Dyke. And then the next image is the next step in that. There's a double reason for this slide. You have a little Meissen sugar box from the 1720s, a very important KPM, Royal Porcelain Works out of Meissen, because it was in Meissen that the first hard paste Asian-style porcelain, or Asian formula, Asian recipe porcelain was produced for the king. And some of them are actually decorated with Chinese motifs, but this little jewel-like box would have been a precious object when it was new. And next to it is a French, maybe Paris, maybe Sèvres, maybe Limoges, we don't know, but part of a whole porcelain tea service showing Napoleon's victories, which, well, that went south. But those are both owned, those were both collected in the 19th century by a very rich New Yorker for her huge mansion on 69th Street. And then left to the Newark Museum in the 1940s. So this idea of porcelain being precious, something that people with money and power collected, has deep roots. And it carries on through into the Gilded Age in modern terms, or in terms of collectibles rather than pure status, but about the idea of the arty side of it. And again, I'm the cautionary tale here. These are both things that were collected in the Gilded Age and came to the Newark Museum in the 20th century. The one on the left, the vase on the left, is from Japan, and it was from the Satsuma kilns. And it's not actually porcelain, it's pottery. It's a white earthenware. And all of the Satsuma is pottery. It's heavily collected. It was collected in the 19th century. There were shops devoted to it in New York City, and it was always called porcelain, even though it was never porcelain. But I just want you to know that people lie, and always. And I love the vase on the left because it's a Japanese piece, not made for Japanese taste, but made for Western taste. The Japanese kilns at Satsuma sent delegations to the KPM porcelain works in Vienna, or not in Vienna, Germany, thank you, in Meissen, in the 19th century to learn their enameling skills, because they knew that it was the white people in the West who were going to buy a lot of their stuff and double their market. And there's a whole, I'm sure there have been books written about the relationship, the ceramics relationship between Japan and the United States. But that was one of the founding collection pieces from the Newark Museum, this Japanese vase. And on the right is a complicated object. It is a Chinese piece, maybe Qianlong, maybe Qing, meaning maybe 18th, maybe 19th century, made for the Islamic market. And then somehow it lost its lid and went into the American market, was purchased by a wealthy pair of brothers who were collectors in New York City in the 19th century named Jena, and taken to Tiffany & Company, where it had a new silver lid made. So I love that kind of thing. Because clearly these were objects that were purchased as ornaments for somebody's Gilded Age house. And the prestige of exoticism, but also of the porcelain, even though the Satsuma piece wasn't literally porcelain. And I want to remind people that always, and this is something that as an art pottery curator and as a ceramics curator in general, that everybody forgets, is that the basic lure of Asian ceramics was this piece on the left, a Qianlong vase with a tea dust glaze from our Chinese collection. Newark has an extraordinary Asian collection, 30,000 objects. And this is one of the most beautiful, simplest pieces. But these very simple monochrome pieces were hugely desirable to more sophisticated collectors. I say that, sophisticated, because often they said, oh, let's buy this so I'll look sophisticated. But this was the standard of beauty in ceramic art in the late 19th century. Not modernism, not Art Nouveau, not any of that stuff, but these very austere, pristine objects that became the standard. And the piece on the right was made in Newark, New Jersey in 1906. It's signed and dated. The museum bought it in 1910 for $6. No, I'm sorry, $15. It was that's really expensive. That's like a week's salary for a curator in 1906. But these were clearly modeled on Chinese forms But the drippy glazes are not Chinese. The drippy glazes are Japanese. And it's this wonderful Western idea that the Chinese and the Japanese are almost the same, even though culturally that's really not true. And so these Chinese forms with Japanese glazes is something that the French really perfected before Americans got around to it in the art pottery world. And on the left on this slide is a piece I bought for the museum because we didn't have one, by Adrien Dalpeyrat, who was an art potter in France outside of Paris, who specialized, the other museums collect the Art Nouveau looking pieces with this beautiful red glaze, which is a reduction copper glaze that would turn red or green depending on your firing, but with a classic sort of an Asian shape. And Dalpeyrat was very much interested in this, again, the same combination of a Chinese form with a Japanese glaze. And to its right is a late 19th century, still high Gilded Age variation that came out of Boston or Chelsea, Massachusetts, by Hugh Robertson, which is the same idea. It's a dense white porcelaneous clay with these sort of dripping glazes that were thought to feel very Japanese. This is done in Europe as well at the same time. But these classic forms are something that you can't forget about because they influence everybody's taste. They show up in everybody's house in one form or another. Just to show you two more that the Newark Museum bought when they were brand new. This English piece with one of my favorite pieces, very Chinese form, but with an iridescent orange glaze, and this tiny little 6-inch high porcelain bottle by Adelaide Robineau, the first great studio potter, woman studio potter in America, early in the 20th century, acquired by the museum in 1914 for $19, I think it was. So. And there was a note on the card, only in cases. In other words, don't put flowers in it on your desk. This is a work of art. So this tradition is really well rooted, and it's very much part of the idea of porcelain as art and porcelain objects as desirable for Gilded Age homes is not at all new. But now we're going to go back and look at a different realm of aesthetics for this. So here is in your gallery, and I just took a photograph of them, you have half of this service on display, from which I call the Symington Berry service. And there's some reason we know it was a berry service. But this was given to us in the 1960s by a family in Newark. And they had bought it from Tiffany and Company. And that's why they gave it to us, that this is our Tiffany Berry service, which I don't think they ever used. I think they displayed it in their dining room. And they had a big Victorian dining room. I'll show you the house in a minute. But this is, I think, the only intact surviving berry service with 6 round and 6 square plates and 4 serving plates. All of it done in Trenton, New Jersey by Otten Brewer and retailed by Tiffany and Company. It has stamps, not on every piece, but it has stamps on enough of them that you can prove it. And I always loved it, but I didn't fully understand the rarity of the survival of all of these pieces unbroken. And it represents, in the time, 2 things. It represents the idea that you could pretend you could buy dishes and justify buying them because you were going to use them, and then not use them because they were so expensive and they had more status on your sideboard than they did on your table. And I'm just guessing. There's no chips. They're really in amazing condition. But also the fact that this is American. This is New Jersey porcelain, and these people are buying it. They're in New Jersey. They go to New York City, which is only 10 miles from Newark, and they buy it at Tiffany and Company. So they go out of New Jersey to buy this stuff and bring it back to New Jersey. I always thought that was hilarious. But it's this moment of triumph for the New Jersey ceramics industry when these luxury goods begin to compete with the English and French things that have been and the German things that have been in the market for 100 years already. So here's the house on the left, the Symington house, built in the early 1800s as a big house. It is still on Military Park, which was the old militia ground with the Episcopal Cathedral in front of them. And now it's a completely industrial and commercial space. And the family lived here until 1965 with servants and living right out of the Gilded Age, and then finally aged out and left. And the chair, I just put that in there. It's in the museum collection. It's in the dining room of the Ballantyne House, I think. But it's one of the things that came to us from that house. And they actually renovated the house in the 1880s to be a modern Gilded Age house. And then somewhere in the 20th century, most of that got ruined or taken away anyway. But so I'm glad we have these fragments, but I shouldn't say fragments when I'm talking about porcelain, but we have this wonderful dessert service from the Symingtons. And so where did that come from? I talked about that because this is the old Tiffany and Company store that was built, opened in 1870 on Union Square and became the greatest brand name in America by actually 1867, even before the store was built, because they showed at the Paris World's Fair in 1867, then again in 1878 in Paris, and won lots of prizes for their jewelry, for their silver, for their retail displays of ceramics. So Tiffany became the powerful name in luxury retailing, and they're coasting on that coattail ever since. And then you can see the main showroom on the ground floor of Tiffany's. So they did everything. I've studied, the Tiffany Archives is still in New Jersey. Their silver factory was in Newark, New Jersey for 100 years, so I've studied their history a lot. And they started out as a fancy goods store. You could buy stationery and lacquer boxes and all sorts of stuff. And then they realized the power of their brand name and began to manufacture their own things and become major importers. So if the Symingtons wanted to buy their porcelain at Tiffany's, they would have gone to the second floor to the porcelain room. And this is an 1880s shot of the porcelain room at Tiffany's. And Lord help us all. And this is in the Tiffany archives, and this was the sort of photograph that was just buried in the archives because nobody liked this stuff when I was a child. This was bad taste. I mean, my parents would have shuddered and gone, ugh. But the fact is, this is what made people swoon. This is why people went to Tiffany's in the 1870s as if it was a museum, because the Metropolitan Museum had not been founded until 1870 and didn't have anything to show until well into the 1880s. So people would go to Tiffany's and they advertised themselves as being like an art museum. And you could go and swoon over the porcelain. Some of it's French. A lot of it should be German. There may be some American pieces in there. But, wouldn't I love to take a time machine and go back and do some shopping? Just looking at the marks. I wouldn't disrupt the timeline. I would just say, I want to look at the marks. I want to see who made all this stuff. Because it's quite extraordinary. And then look at this piece. Because this shows up in a rather important interior decorated by Louis Comfort Tiffany in 1882, which is the Red Room at the White House, decorated for Chester Arthur in 1882. And mind you, the furniture in here is all from Ulysses S. Grant's term, purchased by his wife in 1874. But there is that vase by the fireplace in the Red Room, and it's still in the White House. There were two of them, and they got rid of one of them because it was ugly, they thought, so they got rid of the other one. Ellen Wilson, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, is probably the one who saved it, because it shows up in one of her interiors from the night. Remember, I wrote a book on the White House, so I'm obsessed about that too. But where else? So here's a great period interior with porcelain vases that are not from Trenton, but you could see what Trenton was up against. When Louis Tiffany goes out to buy fancy ceramics for the White House, he does not buy Trenton ceramics. But maybe that was just because they didn't make anything big enough for the Red Room. Other people in the Gilded Age, other people in Newark had fancy ceramics in their houses. And I wish I had more pictures of this house. This house still exists, built in the 1880s. It's the William Clark House. Now, one of the weird things about Newark is I've realized over the years that all the big mansions of the Gilded Age millionaires were built within sight of the factories that made the stuff that gave them money. That's, I think, unique in the United States. And William Clark's house is up in the north end of Newark in Forest Hill. It's now a community center. But it was on the highest point in Newark called Mount Prospect. And from that house, you could see the Coates and Clark factories, the thread factories in East Newark. I mean 2 or 3 million square feet of factories making thread that made the Clarks extremely rich. And this wonderful house survives, amazingly, in the north end of Newark, which is mostly residential. And here's the front hall of that house as it was published in the 1880s in a book called Artistic Houses. And there are no ceramics in the room, sorry. And the only thing, the Newark Museum did end up with one thing from this house, which is the pedestal under that sculpture. Not the sculpture, just the pedestal. It may be gone now. And I've always wondered about that horn chair, because it's pretty cool. There is one in the Mint. Oh, there's in that show at the Mint Uptown is a horned chair. But anyway, this house has lost all of its great interior decoration, but the room, the stairway is still there. But the Clarks did own this, and we know that because William Clark's daughter-in-law gave us these vases in 1930 and said they came from the Hamilton Palace sale, which means nothing to you, but to decorative arts curators, it's, oh my God, that's like Celebrity City. And these enormous 3.5-foot tall vases made in Sèvres between 1806 and 1809 were extraordinary. And she said they came from the Hamilton Palace sale and were given and were acquired in the 19th century, in the 1880s, by the Clarks. That's a great story. The problem is these were not in the Hamilton Palace sale, because I've done that research too, and a lot of French people have been looking into this. There were 8 pairs of these huge vases made in this period. 4 of them had marble bases, 4 of them had bronze bases. And what we have in Newark is a pink one and a red one from 2 different pairs. It's the only pair in the Americas. The rest of them are all in France. And so but there were 4 of them that came out of the Hamilton Palace sale in 1882. And I point that out because that was a very famous sale of a huge estate, the Duke of Hamilton's house, which he was getting rid of because it was collapsing into the coal mines that made him rich. So the house sat mostly empty for a long, long time until it was torn down. But the sale in 1882 was a place where Americans went and shopped. The Vanderbilts shopped at the Hamilton Palace sale. There were all sorts of agents from New York City buying for rich Americans. And at some point in that period, these 2 great vases came to Newark, New Jersey. And they're not, I don't know if I've had one of them on view once upon a time, but they're rather extraordinary objects, and they show the power of these European porcelains. So it's still not Trenton, it's still not Belleek, but it's all part of the same idea. Now, another house that still stands, quite amazingly, it's been recently finally refurbished, is the Gottfried Kruger house. He was one of the great 5 beer barons in Newark. The Ballantines, whose house I was in charge of, were one of the 5, but they were the only one of the 5 who were not Germans. The Krugers were German Catholics. They built the biggest house in Newark on the highest point in Newark, and I have actually stood on the top balcony of that tower, and you can see Manhattan. So it was literally the highest point in that part of New Jersey, and it was an enormous house, half again as big as the Ballantine house, although I would hasten to say I don't think it's quite as refined. And anyway, most of its interiors have been stripped because it was left derelict for a while. And in the 80s, I was called over by a newspaper reporter because the house had been broken into and people were stealing the woodwork. And there's a picture of me at 28 years old standing in the doorway looking confused. So there we are, one of my great moments in newspaper history. But one of the things I discovered, so the Kruger house fortunately has survived, and I've seen pictures and they've gussied it up, but a lot of the interior is gone. But in the Historical Society, the New Jersey Historical Society in Newark, these large photographs survive of the house when it was first finished. And they're extraordinary documents of the history. I've got a tiny image on the screen, but look at how lush that carpeting is. You just know that's thick velvet pile, and everybody needs a grizzly bear rug in front of the fireplace because that's safe. And I mean, you see these in a lot of Gilded Age houses, and you bought them from decorators. You didn't go out and shoot your own bears, but you can see that this is sort of a French drawing room of the 1890s, and it's not gold and white. There's gold and white woodwork, but there's a lot of color going on. The carpet is floral, and then you look at the middle table. What is that? I mean, you know what it is. It's some thing with a handle, clearly not meant to be a pitcher, although it looks like a pitcher. But is that Royal Worcester? Is that Trenton? Is that something else? But you can see the kind of thing. And then over on the, whatever that is, the built-in étagère in the corner, you've got a Parian sculptural group, and you've got other porcelain thingies with probably certainly fake flowers in them. And then there's some sort of a pot on the floor in front. That's probably Chinese with ormolu mounts. And then other little jugs. So there's ceramics around. I also point out that the 4 chandeliers in the room are lit with gas candles. So it's a great document. These photographs are just incredible. But what kinds of things were these objects? So here, these are American possibilities, and one of them is actually finally Belleek. But on the left is another one of those, let's pretend we're porcelain because people don't know any better, a company founded by a man named Edward Lysette called the Faience Manufacturing Company. Faience is a clue because that's pottery, but decorated in the Worcester style. And I love this because it's sort of an Islamic bottle with Japanese decoration painted in Brooklyn. So it has this, there's all this stuff going on, and I bought this early in my career. This is in the Ballantine House still. And then on the right, one of the pieces, oh, and this is where I'll bring this in, this wonderful sort of Oogie classical vase. Oogie is a very academic name for this style. But the other side of this shows a naked lady sitting on a rock or something. And I've always liked the creepy naked babies, so better. The dancing babies, a very popular motif. Are there any dancing babies in the show? I've forgotten. Lots of flowers. There you are. Oh, well, there's that. Yes, those naked babies. But this is a piece that came from the Ceramic Art Company and decorated by an immigrant China painter named Hans Nosek, who was both notorious and famous in his time. And it's fairly good size. This is not in the exhibition, but it's maybe 15, 18 inches tall. But it's the kind of sort of luxury goods that when Walter Lenox got his company going, this is what he had in mind, because this is what elite customers wanted. This was art. And I say this because he saw this as just as much art as a painting or a sculpture. And in its period, when this was new, this probably cost as much as a bronze or as a silver trophy. These were expensive objects when they were new, so they were not given or collected lightly. And again, I love this. This came out of the Lenox archives because when Brown-Forman sold off their Lenox shares in the early 20th century, they split the collection, the archives. The paperwork went to Rutgers University, and then the State Museum and the Newark Museum split it. And we were told, oh, there are like 500 objects. And we said, that's great. And we went to the warehouse, and there were 5,000 objects. And I spent 6 months with the curator at the State Museum picking through the collection. And this was actually one of the pieces that was in the archives. And I said that because I was telling Brian yesterday that then Brown-Forman went through the archives and skimmed off all of the good stuff and put it up at auction. So I had to go to auction and spend thousands of dollars to buy more stuff because I needed more than 2,000 pieces of Lenox china. But anyway, the registrar didn't speak to me for months. But this actually came with the archive because it had a historical association with the governor of New Jersey, who we'll talk about more later. But this is the kind of thing that was in these houses. And what we don't know, and I want to go through every period interior of every Gilded Age house that I can find and see if I can see things that look like this. And there's not enough time in the world to do that because literally no one has paid attention to this because I don't know any curators who actually have time to do serious research. So that's why you should be so proud of doing this show because you did it. And here's the dining room in the Kruger house. And I love this because this room, actually, by the time I saw the house, this room had been stripped. All the woodwork was gone. But look at the mantelpiece. We have look at how thick that carpet is. And it's custom made for the room. It's an octagonal carpet. But those two vases on the lower mantel shelf could very easily be Ceramic Art Company because there were pieces like that that came up in the archive sale that I did not get because J. Lewis bought them. And then up at the top, those oogie things at the top are probably German, and they're probably covered with flowers and lemons or something. There's a certain kind of German porcelain that looks like that. But, and there's no picture, unfortunately, of the other sideboard in the room, which has lots of stuff on it, too. And in the same moment, or a little earlier, actually, this is the dining room of the Ballantine house as it looked when I got to the museum in the early 20th century, in the late 20th century, in the early 80s. And you can see the porcelains, the big German candlesticks on the table, which came from a Newark family, and the Ballantines actually owned candlesticks like that. But you can also see the mixture of other stuff. Ceramics was not alone. Porcelain and other luxury ceramics didn't hold the room down by themselves. It was always glass and silver and ceramics and metalwork, bronzes, little bronzes. Bronzes not so much in the dining room, but you'd have things like the clock and the dishes on the mantelpiece came from the Ballantyne family. And so that's the look, and the more the better. Austerity was not the point. But these are the two pieces on the mantelpiece. They're Viennese. They have the mark of Royal Vienna or whatever that mark is on the back of them from the 1880s or 90s, I'd say 90s. And they came from the Coles family, a prominent family in Newark who were among the early patrons and supporters of the museum in the early 20th century. And what I love about these, what you can't see, and you were saying about this, it's so hard you can't see the backs, because the backs of these, so during Christmas, I would turn these around so all you would see was the gold decoration, this incredible gold pastework all over the backs, because that felt more Christmassy to me, because we did all this Christmassy stuff. And then off season, I would turn them around. But I love the people. This is the mindset of the Gilded Age. On the left is Marie Louise of Austria, who was Napoleon's second wife after he divorced Josephine for not giving him a son. Marie Louise gave him a son, and she got a diamond necklace, which is in the Smithsonian. And then Ruth from the Bible. And I'm thinking, okay, so we're hedging our bets here. We're going very profane and very religious. Austere Ruth, who is like picking up wheat grains off the ground. So the mindset of the 19th century is very much, we love being rich, but we're really nervous about it because we go to church. Anyway, and I don't know anything about the Coles family except that Abraham Coles was a famous doctor, and his unmarried children collected art. I'm not sure why that was relevant, except I think about them, Emily and Jay Coles. And here are just two variations on ceramic art company products that you might have found in these houses. This is a great vase by William Morley, painted with roses. It's about 18 inches tall. That's in the Ballantyne house now. And it really is a canvas for his incredible skill as a flower painter. He was famous for roses, although he painted all sorts of stuff. He painted bridges, he painted horses, he painted birds, fish. I mean, he was the hot decorator at Ceramic Art Company and was revered within the ceramic decorating world, whatever that was at the time. And then you'll see variations on this in the show with decoration. This is one of the blanks. We also inherited a large group of undecorated whitewares, which Lenox made. I don't think anybody bought them in the period to show them empty. But you see the great forms, and I think Walter Lenox probably had a lot to do with the design of these. And there are lots of variations on that were sold blank to professional decorators and other decorating companies to gussy up for the Gilded Age interior. And now I want to look a little bit at sort of the roots of this, because I always want to go back to what is Walter Lenox thinking about. He didn't make this up out of whole cloth. He didn't wake up and say, oh, ceramics is art, I'm going to invent the idea. But these are also pieces that came from the same family, the Coles family in Newark, and came to the museum in the 1920s. And these are my terrible, camera pictures, but they're good enough. I've tweaked them enough so you can see them. But these are ormolu-mounted porcelain vases that are clearly French. They're done in sort of what they call bleu celeste, which we call turquoise. And they have portraits. I love this because Americans love this. The only people they loved more than Napoleon, that we as Americans loved more than Napoleon, was Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. Because portraits of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were hanging in the Senate chamber when they were executed. They helped fund the American Revolution. So they were heroes, and then suddenly, oh, they're dead. and then they became sort of embarrassing. But Americans loved them. And these were purchased by the Coles in the 19th century, and they came to the museum with the provenance that they had belonged to Napoleon. And I'm thinking, why would Napoleon? Then I was following the tortured logic. And then I realized they were probably, in fact, made, they're not 18th century, they were made under Napoleon III. So that may be how the story got garbled. Because Napoleon III and his wife Eugenie, who had American roots, revived all of the sort of imperial level stuff of the Ancien Regime in Paris during that wonderful era in the middle of the 19th century, which Americans loved. Empress Eugenie was way more influential than Queen Victoria ever thought of being, because she was very chic. And And that relates to this. The monkey is a joke, but I'll get to him. But this great ormolu vase, which is this tall, ormolu-mounted vase, I think is actually made in Trenton. And it's signed by a painter that we can't track down. But we know that the Trenton, the ceramic art company, did ormolu-mounted vases. And we actually have one that's a little disappointing that someone gave us. But I've always thought this one is very... it's meant to look French, but the shape is not really French. It really looks like an American piece. So that's one of we've actually taken it all apart, and we can't find any marks. So, but that has a history in Newark from the time it was new. So it could well have been made in Trenton, but represents that most pretentious and ambitious line. The other one I'm pointing out because he's been buried back in the storerooms, but this is Meissen. This is a life-size porcelain monkey. Who I thought was gray until we cleaned him, and he turned out to be white. And so this came out of a great Gilded Age house in New York. But what I loved about it that I didn't realize is that the base of it, this ormolu base, is signed E.F. Caldwell, E.F. Caldwell, who was a lighting manufacturer and a metalworking company in New York City. So this Meissen monkey was imported and then given an American base. It's the same company who did all the chandeliers for Teddy Roosevelt's White House. So I loved that because this actually has an American angle to it. Now, a couple of fun pictures because period interiors are always good and instructive. This just showed up on Facebook and I stole it instantly because that's what Facebook is for. And it's Upper East Side is all it said on the slide image, 1906, a birthday party. And that rather mortified little boy being clutched by his grandfather at the back of the room, and all of his friends with all these birthday cakes, but ignored them because look at all the stuff. And you see the porcelains or whatever they are, the ceramics on top of the sideboard. Everything else seems to be glass and silver in that huge sideboard. But in the vitrine at the back, that looks like there's porcelain, although this is the problem with period photographs. What is it? We don't know. But you can see again this tradition of all this stuff. And of course, nothing breakable is on the table because it's children. But this is the same time. This is Governor's Island in 1907. And it's a 4th of July party. And you can see the sideboards. One sideboard with all that silver, the big sideboard which has some porcelain plates. Are they American? Are they French? I can guess, actually, for reasons I'll explain. And then the smaller vitrine with the punch bowl on top. I know that porcelain because my mother owned that punch bowl. Because the man and the woman at each end of the table are my great-grandparents. Those are Ulysses S. Grant's son, Fred, and his wife, Ida, my great-grandmother. And they're having a 4th of July party in honor of U.S. Grant because he was the commandant at Governor's Island when he died. And in fact, the glassware on the table is all in my dining room now. So I love this. This is just a copy. I don't know what happened to the original photograph. But here they all are trying to have a casual little lunch in 1907, which is the year my grandparents were married. And these two objects were in that room somewhere. And these are both mine, actually, because I wanted them and no one else did. But this goes back to what we've been talking about, though. On the left is part of an enormous custom service with a monogram, USG, that Ulysses S. Grant did not care about, but his wife wanted and gave him the victory laurel wreath around his monogram. After he won the Civil War, she suddenly had money and he had a good job, and so she ordered Chinese porcelain, as one does. So this is the Grant service of the rose medallion pattern from 1868, which I believe, although I've just been arguing about this with someone, that they took with them when they went into the White House. And I only believe that because they sold their house and all their furniture when they went into the White House because they thought it would never end. I don't know what they were thinking. But they literally sold everything and had to start all over again at the end. But this plate is one of a set of a dozen French Sèvres chateau plates, because I love chateaus, and I got them because no one else wanted them. And this shows Azé le Rideau. But this is plates that the Grants bought when they were on their world tour between 1877 and 1879, because when you retire from the presidency and you have no pension and no income, of course you go around the world. Now, back to New Jersey. So the Ballantyne house, as it looked in 1890, with its brother Robert Ballantyne next door, and the Marcus Ward house, All of those are gone now. And the Marcus Ward House, built in 1830, was torn down to build the Newark Museum. And then next to it is the way the house looked in 1937 when the museum acquired it as offices. So fortunately, because in 1937, this was a house that was either offices or demolished. Don't kid yourself, nobody liked this stuff in the 1930s. They were tearing down Victorian houses faster than you could say Jack Robinson. See, nobody younger than me is going to know what that means. And then, so here we have a period photograph of the reception room in 1885 when the house was first built. And I could go on and on endlessly about the decoration, but you don't care, and I don't need to. But you can see all the stuff on the mantelpiece. And you can't because the picture is so blurry, but there's also a lot of stuff on the mantelpiece in the parlor. Stuff on every surface, that was the rule. And then here is a contemporary image of the reception room in the Ballantyne house with more stuff and different stuff, but stuff that's appropriate to the period. And we'll talk a little bit about, actually there are pieces of glass on the mantelpiece that we know were there in 1880, or in the 1890s anyway. And here's a shot of the library, the period shot of the library in the Ballantyne house with all the stuff, bronzes, glass, ceramics lined up along the bookcases. Whoops, I didn't go, what's going up? Oh, yes, okay, sorry, confused myself. And then you jump ahead, and the room has been changed somewhat, but a lot of the ceramics are still there. And what I love about this, and this was here when I got to the museum, so I never changed it, but on the mantelpiece, you have Renaissance busts of Albrecht Dürer and Rembrandt by a French artist in the 1890s that the Ballantynes bought for that room. So let's not buy old paintings, let's buy modern sculptures of old artists, and it will be just as good. But they're also, and these are not authentic to them, but they're authentic to the idea, is that the Chinese oxblood vases, the simple Chinese forms on the mantelpiece, actually make perfect sense, along with ivory figurines from Japan. Except for the bronzes, none of these things belong to the Ballantynes. We inherited an empty house and decorated it in the 1970s. But all of the different ceramics and glass and stuff along the bookcases make perfect sense. And there's no Belleek in here, so I'll skip right through that. But these are just to remind you that this always cycles back. These terrible cheeseball versions of expensive French plates belong to the Ballantynes and are in the dining room, and they're decals of Napoleon and Josephine, and decals of gold decoration. So this is as cheap as you could get. So I don't know what maybe they bought them when they were in France and they were souvenirs in the gift shop at Versailles or something. So who knows? But I'm shocked because these things Lenox never did anything this cheesy until well into the 20th century. After Walter Lenox was dead, I'm sure they didn't use decals while he was alive. But it's so interesting that these exist, and these are from the 1890s. And then, just to give you another couple of shots of the parlor, which has been rearranged somewhat, but you get a sense of all the stuff. And we're going to talk about some of the stuff in the room, just to give you a sense of what this was up against. And these are all things that have histories in Newark, although not in this house. One of my favorite objects, it's quite small, it's only 6 inches tall, but the vase on the left by George Owen for Royal Worcester, 1894. Or 1893 actually, possibly even shown at the Chicago World's Fair. But all that articulated work, this is only this tall, and all of that work is done by hand. George Owen was obsessive compulsive. It's one of my favorite kinds of craft, obsessive craft. And he was famous for these carved lacework pieces because, of course, a lot of them just collapsed in the kiln. And you can see on the bottom that was retailed by Tiffany and Company in New York. And the other piece is just a little Minton jug that's more typical of what people are buying. Small, but these little tchotchkes were important. You had cabinets to fill, you had mantelpieces to stuff, all these spaces to put these porcelains. 2 more Royal Worcester carved pieces, probably by George Owen, both of them from Newark family. So this was done a lot. And this is what, Lenox never went into that because he had enough brains not to kill his profit margin by having someone carve these pieces. And then my personal favorite, because this came to the museum in 1920 from a Newark family. It's quite substantial, and I call it Louis XV meets Aladdin, because I'm really trying to figure out what they were thinking. But you see a lot of motifs like this, these sort of lattice work arches that are sort of half Persian and half French. And this came to the museum. It's Royal Crown Derby, 1890. And the museum got it, and they called the Metropolitan Museum and said, should we keep it? They wrote them. I have letters. And the Met said, oh, yeah, it's good quality. Keep it. It's good craftsmanship. But, in 1920, this stuff was like, throw it away. And thank God we kept it, because I've never seen a piece of Crown Derby like this. It's quite extraordinary, and it's pink. So it's this wacko 1890s aesthetic that just screamed money to people. This was a classy object that made you sophisticated. And you probably loved it. I'm not being cynical. I think they loved this stuff. But my mother's generation grew up with a total disparagement of this, even though my grandparents would have seen and lived with stuff like this as young people. But it's that one generation turned on this, and my generation re-embraced it. Now, these two are also from a Newark family. The same family, the Coles, both of them dated, Royal Worcester dated 1894. And I love these because they're what I call the mixed metaphors. The purists don't like this because they want the Japanese decoration on Asian-looking forms. But these are classical forms, basically based on ancient Greek vases with this Japanese enamel decoration on it. And I love these because this is Americans hedging their bets, wanting to be modern but not wanting to be too modern. And likewise, more of this, because these two pieces I acquired because of the dragon handles, because in the middle is a piece of Willets with Royal Worcester type decoration with a dragon handle. Willets did a lot of dragon handles. This is the only one I have a picture of, as a matter of fact. But the Wedgwood teapot on the left is actually earthenware, white earthenware, designed by Hugh Protot in the 1870s. And then the Royal Worcester teapot from 1872 on the right is porcelain. But it just shows you that this is what was in the air, and all of this stuff was being sold by places like Tiffany's. Every luxury department store in the country sold this kind of stuff in the 19th century. Now, a sidebar here, because it is important to understand that one of the origins of porcelain as art in America, is specifically tied to a man named Isaac Broom, who was a sculptor who worked for Ottenbrewer and worked for other places too, and we'll get in, he worked for all of them. But he starts with Ottenbrewer in the 19th century and totally makes Ottenbrewer's reputation at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876 by designing piles of ceramic sculpture. And you guys, I'm so formal, have one of the baseball vases, or the baseball figures, neither one of those.
Not those.
And then the baseball vase is not in the picture. And there's Cleopatra, which the State Museum owns. There's an Elaine, Newark Museum owns one of those. And there are all these busts of famous people, from Shakespeare to Benjamin Franklin to whoever those modern, one of them looks like my grandfather Dietz. I don't know who that is. And then that little sad boy crying in the side, Newark Museum owns that. That's called forced prayer. And I love bigotry, because that was the American Protestant notion of what the Catholics would do to America. That U.S. Grant got very caught up in the idea of not funding parochial schools, that public schools were non-denominational because they would force prayer. Anyway, I just want you to think about that for a while, because it's not a gone topic, is it? But Isaac Broom single-handedly made porcelain sculpture. It was not new. It existed in England already, the Parian sculpture of the 1840s and 50s, but suddenly it became a hot thing in American manufacturers and in New Jersey. These are both by Isaac Broom for Ottenbrewer. Elaine from the Centennial Exhibition. She's from a poem by somebody important. And then U.S. Grant as president was a very popular figure. This came out of a Newark family, came to us in 1930. So this is the sort of thing. U.S. Grant's last great public act was to open the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 by turning on the Corliss steam engine in Philadelphia. And then later, Isaac Broom kept going until the end of his life. He did this bust of Walter Lenox, which is less than life-size, but big, and you couldn't borrow it for the show. But he became a very close friend of Walter Lenox late in Lennox's life when he was losing his eyesight, and did this bust for Lenox Incorporated in 1917. But also early in the 20th century, and there are very few of these out there, he did this bust of John Roebling from Trenton, who built the Brooklyn Bridge, who designed the cable system that made those bridges possible. And you can notice the cable wrapped around the base. And this was given to the Newark Museum by the Roebling family at Walter Lenox's insistence in 1911. So it's a piece I'm very proud of. It's not very big, but it's the idea that Broome keeps going. And he wasn't the only one in America. This is the New York City pottery, James Carr, but you saw that porcelain figure group in the Kruger House in Newark. That's a biblical, Jacob and Rachel, which is about this tall, so an extremely important, high-quality porcelain figural group from an American maker. And then the rarest of all is Senator Charles Sumner, who I've always been fond of because he hated Ulysses S. Grant and lied about him. I mean, he was the father of the total fake news issue in politics because he resented U.S. Grant, who was a hick from the West, and he was an aristocrat, a Brahmin from Boston. But he also is distinguished by having almost been beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by a congressman from South Carolina who objected to his stance on slavery. Just putting that out there. He was literally almost beaten to death in front of his colleagues on the floor of the Senate. Not even by a senator, but by a congressman who shouldn't have been there anyway. So that's why he is memorialized as one of these great figures. But I actually hate him. And then these are even sillier. So this is the only known piece from the Monument Pottery of Trenton, which is a copy of an English Parian statue called Go to Sleep. So that's a very highbrow idea, this little girl making her puppy go to sleep, probably based on Greyfriars Bobby or something. And then the saddest and most important of all is William Bloor, back in the 1850s, trying to do a porcelain copy of the Greek slave based on English Parian pieces that were already being produced. And that's the only known one, and you can see why, because it's pretty sad looking. But we're very proud of it because it's ours. It's only, it's only that tall. But to carry on a little bit, and I'm just now I'm retracing a little bit just because the idea of porcelain in Trenton really doesn't start until the 1850s. And these are two and actually that's not even from Trenton, but these are two very early 1850s pieces of porcelain that show the beginning of that. This big clunker pitcher, which is about 1.5 gallons by William Young, signed and dated on the bottom of it. And then this small jug that was J. and Emma Lewis gave us this from the American Porcelain Company in Gloucester, New Jersey, which is down south near Trenton. So the Trenton area is trying to produce porcelain, but it really isn't until the 1850s that it takes. So you can see that when places like the Union Porcelain Works in the 1870s you have a great piece in this collection, this jug, anyway, I could go into the whole lecture on these jugs, but forget it. But Union Porcelain Works in Brooklyn started producing these, and they were shown at the Centennial in Philadelphia. And then when Union Porcelain Works went under, the Cook Pottery in Trenton bought their molds. And this piece is made by Cook Pottery in the 1890s in Trenton, also from Emma and J. Lewis, by the way. And this porcelain, the Liberty Tea Service showing George Washington, this is a slide of it in the storeroom, so sorry. But this porcelain tea service was produced in white for the Centennial exhibition. So this was when when New Jersey and Trenton were just beginning to think, ooh, we have a chance. It's not just toilets for us. Toilets were very important, but... And just to really go through a few more ideas of things that didn't come into this exhibition, but Ottenbrewer played the game because Walter Lenox only wanted to do fine china, to do art porcelain. Ottenbrewer would do anything it could make money with. And it still failed, but anyway, that's the way businesses work. So there is a tea set by Ottenbrewer with a huge shell tray up in your galleries, and this is a variation on that with transfer printed and gilded decoration. But the plates next to it are the same pattern, but they're pottery. They were a cheaper price point. So Ottenbrewer was selling white earthenware, decorated. We have a bunch of it at Newark of different periods, and then these very dressy porcelains. And this little tea service is in the Ballantyne House now. And then Willits, where Lenox went second and carried the Belleek technology with the Bromleys to Willits, where he was the art director. These are all Willits pieces that came with a specific collection to the Newark Museum in the late 1970s, showing different kinds of decoration. And here you see a variation on the Cupid and the tree branch candlestick, both decorated and undecorated. So this early stuff was desired white. So that's why I wonder about the undecorated vases, because the whiteness of the porcelain always had a kind of status for those people who didn't need a lot of decoration. And there were other decorators, and this exhibition does talk about the Callowhills, but there was another porcelain company called Morris & Wilmore. They didn't do a lot, and I bought several pieces. This is just a decorative charger. And then the smaller plate is a Willets piece decorated by James Callowhill. And the next slide here, this is a Morris & Wilmore coffee pot that came from the Lewises. That's why the terrible image of it. And then greenwood pottery that mostly did hotel china. You know, big clunky white porcelain pitchers that they'd slam down on the table in a dining room in a hotel. But they did their line of Net Plus Ultra porcelains. And this couple who gave you things and gave Newark things, gave us this great Japanese style vase, which was, I'm sure they never made any money off of this line. And Walter Lenox's very first pattern at the Ceramic Art Company that Mark and Lori Knorr, who lent to this show, sold me, is the Hawthorne pattern. So this is sort of one of the early attempts at production line, Royal Worcester, no, Belleek porcelain. And then next to it, because you've got that great spider claret set, this is a Ceramic Art Company, 1890s, a Japanese sake jug, obviously repurposed, made in porcelain in Trenton, but then covered with silver overlay by Lapierre in Newark, and obviously meant for Scotch, just in case you thought it was supposed to be sake. I love this idea of this sort of Japanesey decoration with Scotch whiskey in it. I will say one of the largest producers of Scotch whiskey today is Japan, because Scotch is everybody's favorite now. And there's some fabulous baskets. The one on the left, oh no, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. These are both in Newark's collection. The one on the left is actually English, made a Parian basket made in the mid-19th century, although acquired in New Jersey as Bennington from Vermont. There's a whole sad story there, but that's why we have it. And then next to it is a Willets basket, using this Belleek technique, this incredible fussy technique where people knew how to make these little thin spaghetti strands out of porcelain. Because the Belleek body is, as people say, it's mostly glazed, so it's very hard, and you can do crazy stuff with it if you have the right equipment. And so this is an undecorated Willets one. Very few of these known. You've got two great examples, plus an Irish one in the show. And then here on the left, these are the two that Walter Lenox gave to the Newark Museum in 1911. One of them's in the show. And these are quite amazing. But these were shown in 1910 in a show called Modern American Pottery, along with Rookwood and Gruby and other kinds of art pottery. So this must have, either the curator loved this because he didn't get the joke, or this just shows you the transition that Walter Lenox was still living in the 19th century. And really toward the end of this is just, these relate to things in your show. This enormous, rather violent show of an eagle attacking another eagle who's trying to attack a baby deer. It's right out of Heidi or something, I don't know. But this thing is this big, it's huge, and painted by one of the Callowhills, James Callowhill. And then the huge blue charger, I think, is attributed, it says in our files, William Morley, but it could be Lawrence Sturgis, it could be anybody, but this was decorated at Ceramic Art Company and came to the museum with the archives. I've never figured out what to do. I don't know who would want that or where. It doesn't, I guess it's dining room, but really, ugh. And then my final question that I'll pose as I close down is, can dishes be art? And of course, obviously the answer is yes, because that's the point of this show. But here you have a great long-lost mansion with its own private art gallery in Newark that was built by New Jersey Governor Franklin Murphy, who was a varnish magnate, who had one of the biggest varnish plants, Murphy Varnish. And he could see his house from this park, from Lincoln Park in Newark, across the railroad tracks into the Ironbound. And he was a founding trustee of the Newark Museum, and in fact, bought the Greek slave, one of the great Hiram Powers sculptures of the Greek slave that had belonged to another Gilded Age millionaire, A.T. Stewart, and gave it to the Newark Museum in the 1920s. But he collected, among other things, porcelain, and he was a patron of Walter Lenox's. And these are both plates from services that Franklin Murphy commissioned. and came out of the Lenox archives. There's his personal dinner service, decorated by Lenox, designed by Frank Holmes in the early 20th century. And then one of his beauties plates, this whole service, which are clearly service plates or display plates of beautiful women painted by, okay, I've got his name, Bruno Geyer, in the early 20th century. That's the only one of those. We got one of each of those. I had to kind of beg for those, but I was thrilled to have them. And back to Hans Nosek and the Naked Babies. The Naked Baby dinner services by Hans Nosek with this incredible gold work. You could do a whole talk on the gold paste work, which was, Lenox did it as well as anybody in the world in the early 20th century. And mind you, Lenox China did not have to advertise until the end of the Depression. They never advertised. Rich people bought Lenox China because they talked about it. But eventually they had to advertise. And then another Bruno Geyer plate with great Art Nouveau border, another one of his beauties. You can tell Bruno Geyer because they're really beautiful. So my final image is that, yes, plates can be art. Walter Lenox didn't want to make dishes, but that was the trend. That's what people wanted. Fine china made in America was what people were pushing for. So he finally gave up and allowed china dishes to become one of his main lines, and eventually the only main line, along with other ornamental objects. And Frank Holmes would be his designer until 1946. He died, no, or did he die? I've got the date, but I've forgotten to say his death date. Frank Holmes designed hundreds and hundreds of patterns for Lenox China. And if you ran a department store in Chicago and wanted your own pattern, he would add a line to a separate pattern, and that would be your exclusive pattern. So major department stores all over the country had their exclusive patterns from Lenox China that Frank Holmes designed. And when he died, Winslow Anderson took over. And I bring you this as the final shot because this was bought in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1954 by a young woman who was a native here who got married to a New Jersey boy. And she mixed two Lenox patterns, Princess and Kingsley, which were actually based on Royal Copenhagen designs. And she moved to New Jersey and was one of my docents for 30 years at the Newark Museum. And she told me so proudly when I asked her to give me a place setting that she had bought this in Charlotte. And so the Belleek body that Walter Lenox made powerful in the United States, well, I don't know, actually, to be honest, I don't know if it's still made because I don't know who makes Lenox China anymore. It's not made in New Jersey anymore. I think it's made in Pennsylvania, or maybe...
Well, they're headquartered in Bristol, Pennsylvania.
But I think whatever is made in Pennsylvania. But I wanted you to see that it came full circle and it came down to Charlotte because the Belleek body that you never thought about as a Belleek body was all-powerful in American China making. And the Japanese and the English and the French all copied the ivory body of Belleek because they knew Americans would buy it. And that's another lecture. Thank you. Ooh, I can't drink all that.
Ulysses, thank you so much.
I won't have any water because or I'll spill it on the computer. So if you have any questions, I breezed over a lot of material there. Can you catch me? I told 3 lies. No, I didn't.
Ulysses, how does the ceramic industry start in Trenton? What propels it in Trenton, New Jersey?
Well, it builds up in Trenton because Trenton is close to the kaolin beds in Pennsylvania, the white porcelain beds. But also New Jersey is massively endowed with clay beds, stoneware and earthenware beds all over. And by the end of the 19th century, most of those are mined out. There are great maps showing all the clay beds of New Jersey, but Trenton was sort of right in the middle, but it was on the Pennsylvania border, so it had access to the kaolin beds in Pennsylvania. Well, that was a very technical question, but no, it's a good question. It was, yeah.
New Jersey as opposed to Newark,
Yeah.
which was certainly much more manufactured.
Well, Newark was precious metals. That's another lecture. I have it on my computer. That Newark was silver and gold. That's why that show I did, City of Silver and Gold, was all precious metals out of Newark, which people have forgotten. So I studied that. You had a question, yeah?
You were saying you weren't sure where that plate with the eagle I was just thinking maybe it would go in like the gentleman's study where they retreat after dinner to go smoke cigars.
That's a good idea. It's very manly with attacking animals and terrified female animals. Oh, that's perfect, yeah. That's a good point. It's really big and it's beautifully painted. But you can see why it stayed in the Lenox archives, is they couldn't unload it. Nobody would buy that. But it could have shown up in the Tiffany porcelain room. And I was looking on those shelves thinking, is it up there somewhere? But that's a little too early. But you're right. I think you're right. It's a billiard room or a smoking room or a library, any kind of masculine room. I shouldn't be so shallow. I should have thought about that. So I will remember that next time I talk. Good.
Are you saying that Lenox did not want to design? He didn't want to do plates, that he wanted to do the sculpture?
Yeah, he wanted to do vases and, the stuff that's, you've got a lot of plates in the show, but he didn't want to do dishes because he felt that wasn't art enough. But he finally capitulated because, one, you could do a lot of artistic plates, and the show has a lot of them in it, but Newark has a bunch of them too. I mean, that was a big market, these show plates. That were sometimes, they're called cabinet plates, but I think they were used as service plates on dinner tables. But I think they were also used in dining rooms as decoration. So I think that was that was kind of the slippery slope. And then as the pressure, as I say, the Franklin Murphy dinner plate is just a dinner plate, very fancy dinner plate. But I think he realized that he needed profit. And Lenox survived, and none of the other companies survived. And Lenox, even today, in whatever form it is still operating. So I think it was a wise move. So that's when it went from being Ceramic Art Company to being Lenox Inc., which we call Lenox China, but it was never formally called that.
No, I just wanted to say...
You next.
That last pattern was my wedding china.
Oh,
I'm from New Jersey.
Kingsley or Princess?
Kingsley.
With the border, yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say everybody had it that year.
It was huge in 1954. And that's when it was released, and that's when my docent Dolly bought it. And she was, so I love that, because before that, do you know what the most popular pattern before Kingsley was? See, why would you know that? That's only a Curator nerd thing. Autumn, which was a Frank Holmes pattern with quite elaborate with a lot of little dots of bright colored enamel. That was one of the biggest selling patterns up until Kingsley came out. And then, see, it was all about post-war modernism. So,
well, things were changing then, because my silver pattern was themed. It looked like stainless steel. And I didn't have anything on it. In fact, we were robbed one time, and the silver chest was on the sideboard.
And they left it?
They left it. They probably thought it was stainless steel.
Called Theme. Do you know who the maker was?
Gorham?
Okay, could be. Gorham made hundreds of patterns. So I'm really curious. That's an interesting story, because you're right. The same thing happens in the silver industry, is that patterns change and people want simpler.
So we were getting much more modern.
And it was hard for American industry to shift, because people like Lenox didn't think brides wanted modern. And even when Lenox did their centennial patterns in the 1990s, and I got place settings of those for the museum, they're very fussy. There's lots of color and enamel and gold, because they still think brides want that. And I think they were all disasters financially for them. Although you didn't hear that from me. Well, they don't care. They don't even exist in New Jersey, so I don't care anymore. Oh, and you had a question.
I just went to the Duke of Northumberland's home.
Annick?
Lenox Law. It's called.
Oh, that one. Okay.
And they had brought all this porcelain back in. I mean, it's just jammed, because I guess the other home that you mentioned that had been undermined for coal.
Oh, well, that.
And then they destroyed it. And then you said the two pieces came out of there. Right?
Well, the big French vases, no, they didn't. They were supposed to have come out of there, but they came out of France. But see, what the point of that was, so that was Hamilton Palace. That was the Duke of Hamilton's house. And the Northumberlands own Annick Castle, where a lot of Harry Potter was filmed. But they may have, but they were very rich. They also owned a huge house in London called Sion House, which is still open to the public. So they had lots of china. And I have never surveyed the china in an English house, because they never teach you about the Victorian stuff in England. They always look at the earlier stuff. So I'd be interested to know.
The Duke of Hamilton, once that house was done away with, then moved into this other house, which is called Lenox Lodge.
Oh, okay.
And I wondered if there was any connection.
No, I think that's just, Lenox is a good English name, and I don't think there's any connection there. Walter Lenox was born in England?
No, born in Trenton.
Oh, he was born in Trenton. I guess it's some of the other people who... Oh,
his name originally had two N's. He dropped the N.
Oh, that's where the double N versus the single N. It's like people misspell Lenox and they misspell Wedgwood.
Well, you talked a lot about different companies, especially in the U.S., that produce porcelain. I'm kind of wondering, what was porcelain production like in the countries in which it originated, like namely China and Japan?
Oh, well, huge.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a lecture. So I think what we would call real porcelain is, oh no, I don't know the dates. It certainly is around when Westerners make contact with China. And the major manufacturing center by the time of the Qianlong Emperor, Ming Emperor, as a matter of fact, the Ming Dynasty runs until 1644, from the 14th century, and the main porcelain manufacturing is in Qingdacheng, which it still is. But it is a factory town. And what you've got to realize that in the 16th century in China, there were factories where hundreds of potters cranked out bowls all day long, blue and white Ming porcelain, thousands and thousands every day. And because they were the China makers to all of Asia. And Ming blue and white porcelains from China were being mimicked in Vietnam and shipped to Southeast Asia. And I know that because I bought some off of a sunken ship for no money. There were 250,000 pieces on this ship, so there were some cheap things for curators to buy. And so it was a whole world of trade before white people ever stumbled into Asia. And I know that's all I know about it, except that the blue and white Ming stuff was being copied all over Asia by anybody who could make pottery. And so, but that was the major center. Now, other places, I mean, in Japan was Arita, was one of the great kilns, and they built up when the Qingdacheng factories collapsed at some point. I don't remember all the stories, but all the Chinese kilns shut down for a while. And so Japan kicked in and started making Chinese-style ceramics, but then carried on making their own things. And the Japanese were first accosted by Europeans through the Portuguese in the 1540s. And I'm not sure who tripped over China. Marco Polo went to China. Did he buy any porcelain? I don't know. He brought back spaghetti and gunpowder. That's all I remember from school. But they carried on, and literally up until, this is one of the things about World War II and Japan deciding it had to attack Pearl Harbor, is that half of the porcelain made in Japan was sold in American department stores under names like Noritake. And then within 5 years of the war, they were back at it selling Noritake in department stores. So the relationship between Japan and America through the 19th century was huge. The Japanese really invested in merchandising to the United States and to Europe. The Chinese were more reluctant, but the Chinese did a lot of this in the 19th century too. All of the big World's fairs had Japanese and Chinese displays of ceramics. And not enough of work has been done on that, but whatever there has, I've read, and it's completely fascinating. It's all about money. It's all about finding a market. And so all of that, as soon as the West discovered the East realized that we were patsies ready to be bought off because we couldn't make anything like that. The great textiles all start in Asia. And then, I mean, you think of the Asian silks and things that go to Europe and transform Europe. So it's an old story.
I was just wondering, Ulysses, I think you mentioned that Valentine House has national landmark status. Do any of the other mansions that you showed that are in Newark have that kind of protection, or? No,
because I did all the paperwork for the national landmark status for the Valentine House in 1985. And just because I wasn't worried about it, I knew it was safe. National landmark status actually doesn't do anything to help. What they need is a building that's intact and represents its original self more or less intact. And then what happens afterward is fate. But I'm sure there are other national landmark buildings in New Jersey, but not in Newark. We played that up when we got that status because but it doesn't have any legal power. You can tear down a National Historic Landmark if you own it. The hope is you'll be frowned on enough that you won't. But the Kruger House was really left derelict. And we set up the alarm in 1984, and the city got embarrassed and bricked it up, literally just bricked up the doors. And then someone raised money to restore the outside, and then finally, after, this is 40 years later, they've restored the interior as a community art center. And it looks pretty good from what I can see.
Can you visit the Valentine House now?
You can. It just opened on Wednesday. So it's open to the public again. And the period rooms are intact. The house is theoretically the sort of centerpiece of the Decorative Arts collection, but it's now sort of the centerpiece of a whole reinterpretation of the museum as all about the city. But the period rooms are there as originally restored. So there's a lot to see.
Well, can we give another round of applause for our